There is a fundamental problem with index funds. They are being abused by the people who make them and people who use them. And if this continues, which it will, it's likely to result in these investors seeing far lower returns than they expect. Over the last 50 years, there has been a meteoric rise in passive investing, an investing philosophy born out of the fact that most active investment managers fail to beat the benchmarks that they track. The latest Spiva scorecard showed that over 90% of actively managed funds have failed to beat their benchmarks over the last 15 years. These are fund management teams with qualifications, years of experience, and extensive resources whose sole job is to pick companies or sectors of the market that they think will outperform. And yet, the majority of them fail to beat the market. It's so counterintuitive because in every other field of human endeavor, the smarter you are, the more prepared you are, the more effort you put in, the better your results are likely to be. This is true in academia, in sports, in business. But when it comes to investing, the opposite seems to be true. This can be really hard to get your head around at first, but once you do, it's like a light bulb moment. The fact that you can, as someone who knows relatively little about investing, perhaps buy a single fund that doesn't try to beat the market, it just tracks it, and with that, achieve returns that are superior to the vast majority of professional investors out there. It's incredible. John Bogle, the legendary founder of Vanguard, was one of the first people to speak up about the benefits of passive investing. And in 1975, he launched the world's first index fund that, instead of trying to beat the market, would just track it by investing in everything. At first, he was ridiculed by the investment management community. But over time, as the evidence behind the benefits of passive investing became more widely known, the movement grew and grew and grew until where we are today, where apparently there is now more money held in passive funds than there are active, to the extent that many people are now concerned that it's gone too far and that passive investing is causing markets to malfunction. But before you can think about any of that, there is a fundamental problem and a misunderstanding about passive investing that we need to address. Active and passive investing are two differing belief systems. Active investors believe that they or others can reliably predict what markets will do in the future and profit from that. They believe that by taking action, they can improve their returns. Whilst passive investors believe that stock markets are efficient enough that it's near impossible to predict what they're going to do in the future and reliably profit. So instead, the goal is to diversify, to own everything and capture the returns that are on offer. Accepting that, for the most part, we cannot control what those returns will be, and that the more we try to exert our control over them by taking action, no matter how small those actions are, it's likely to leave us in a worse position. If you've clicked on this video, then you're probably already familiar with a lot of this stuff, and perhaps you are already a passive investor, or at least you think you are. So then, what is the primary tool of a passive investor? An index fund. But here is our first problem. Passive investing and index funds are not the same thing. In fact, I would go as far to say that most index funds have nothing to do with passive investing at all. Let me explain. There are two parts to this. The first is with how index funds are created, and the second is with how they are used. Let's start at the very top. What is an index fund? An index fund is a fund that tracks an index. And what is an index? It's a list of companies that have been selected based on a certain set of criteria. And who can create an index? Well, technically anyone can create an index and they can choose whatever criteria they like. As an example, I could create an index that only includes companies that start with the letter A. Why A? Well, just because I quite like the letter, and it happens that companies that start with the letter A have performed really well over the last 10 years. And because of that, I think that other people will want a part of this index. So what I'm also going to do is I'm going to create an index fund to go with it. A fund which tracks a index. Technically, this is a passive fund because it tracks an index, and it would say passive on its fact sheet. But if you invested in this fund, does that then make you a passive investor? No, of course it doesn't. Firstly, because this is an index that I, the index provider, have just made up. And secondly, by choosing to invest in companies that start with the letter A, you're making a very active decision not to invest in the rest of the alphabet. There are 26 letters in the alphabet, but there are thousands of different arbitrary combinations that I could have come up with. But I'd hope you'd agree that for somebody who believes in passive investing, There should only be one combination that would be acceptable, the one that includes companies A through Z. Now, let's bring this back into the real world. There are about 50,000 publicly traded companies in the world, but over 3 million indices. That's right, there are over 60 times more indices than there are individual stocks. So if you thought that trying to pick the right stock was hard, you should try being an index investor. Fortunately, it's not actually that bad because not all 3 million indices have corresponding index funds. Very roughly, there are about 10,000 different index funds out there in the world. But why then would passive investors possibly need that many passive funds? They don't. It's marketing and active management in disguise. Most people think that there are these independent indices out there that kind of just fall from the sky, and then asset management companies come and launch funds that just track them. But often that is not how it works. The marketing teams at asset management firms have one job: sell more product. So someone in the team might come up with an idea for a fund that they think might sell really well. Maybe it's a high dividend yield fund, or an emerging market small cap fund, or even better, get this, a high yield AI growth fund. How good does that sound? And because everybody hates active management, right? Let's make it an index fund and let's launch it as an ETF. That is just going to fly off the shelf. The only problem is that there are often no indices that track these specific areas. So what do? Well, they just make one up. I only recently realized just how prevalent this was when I read a paper called Passive in Name Only, where the author estimates that as many as a third of all index funds are tracking an index that they themselves created or had an affiliate company create them for them. And the point this paper makes is that in the old world, a fund manager would come up with the list of stocks for the fund to invest in. But that's active management, and nowadays that doesn't sell. So instead, let's get the guy down the corridor, the index provider, to come up with a list instead. And now we can call it an index fund, which will sell. And even better, let's launch it as an ETF because, again, retail investors assume that passive investing and ETFs are the same thing. But they're not. ETFs have nothing to do with passive investing. An ETF is just a fund structure. You can have active ETFs, you can have passive ETFs. So seriously, my alphabet index fund analogy is not that far removed from what actually happens. The only difference is that it would actually be much easier to work out what you're actually investing in with one of my alphabet funds than it would with most of these other index funds. So that is why there are roughly 10,000 index funds out there, few of which, in my opinion, have anything to do with passive investing. However, these funds are only a symptom of the real problem. They only exist because there is a demand for them. And the people who buy these funds are either active investors who are looking for passive implementation, or people who think they're passive investors but are actually nothing of the sort. I see this all of the time with our financial planning clients. Most of our clients found me through YouTube, and I'd say that the majority were already using index funds when they first got in touch. And on their first call, they might say, "James, I love your videos and I completely believe in passive investing." But then it turns out that they have a portfolio that looks like this. Yes, technically, these are all index funds. They're passive funds, but this is a mess. And when I press them as to why they've chosen this particular selection, their reasons are typically anything but passive. They either chop and change between them depending on which is performing better or what they've read in the news, or if they're honest, they admit that they've just collected these funds over time with no real rhyme or reason, and now inertia has set in and they can't bring themselves to sort the mess out. So yes, they are holding passive funds, but how is this any different from just holding a random selection of my alphabet funds? It's not. It's exactly the same thing. And by the way, if you want to know what I think an actual passive portfolio looks like, I've made a guide that you can download a copy of down in the description of the video. So please do check that out. Now, you might be thinking, come on, James, you're just splitting hairs here. Surely this person is way closer to being a passive investor than an active investor. How bad can this be? Well, there's two problems. Research indicates that when it comes to diversified portfolios, perhaps up to 90% of a portfolio's return, and more importantly, its risk, is driven by asset allocation decisions. So The decision of how much to hold in cash versus bonds versus commodities, property and stocks. Only a very small part of performance is driven by security selection. So which individual companies or bonds you decide to invest in within each asset class. So although they're using index funds, they're still making active decisions with the most important part of their portfolio. And what's worse is that they often don't even know how much they have invested in each of these buckets at any one time. People who use or abuse index funds like this may think of themselves as passive investors and assume that they are going to reap all of its benefits. And whilst the markets are rising and things are going well, they might not notice that anything is wrong. But it's when markets start to fall and the tide goes out that we start to see who is swimming naked. And this is where the biggest mistakes are made. Being a passive investor is just as much about what you believe in as what you invest in. And there is a massive difference between someone who truly believes in being passive and somebody who kind of does but sins a little. Let me explain with an analogy. I have recently tried cutting all sugar and most carbohydrates out of my diet, and it started off really well. After a week, I found that I had more energy, that was more consistent throughout the day, I could focus, and I wasn't craving sweet things like I used to. But after a while, it became a bit of a grind because pasta, pizza, chocolate are some of my absolute loves in life, and there was no way that I could cut them out of my life forever. So I thought, you know what? Why don't I just sin a little? On some evenings, I'll have some more carbs or something sweet. Surely that's not going to hurt. But my God, I was wrong. As soon as I had carbs back in my diet, I was thinking about them all the time. I had cravings throughout the day. I lost focus, and it made it so much harder to stick to the plan. And I realized that actually cutting them out completely, being absolute about it, was way easier. Because then there is no choice, no distraction, no decisions to be made. The international best-selling book, Atomic Habits by James Clear, is all about this stuff, about improving behavior by setting rules for yourself and being absolute about them. Because once you pick up that habit and it forms a part of your identity, that behavior will just happen on autopilot. There is no should I or shouldn't I, no option paralysis. Your mind won't even go there, which frees up your mental energy to get on and focus on the rest of your life. Well, it's exactly the same when it comes to investing. If you have an investment portfolio that looks like this, or even if you've only invested in the S&P 500 up until this point, let's be honest, you are not a passive investor because clearly there is a part of you that believes in active management, that is distracted and believes that you can select a part of the market that is going to outperform. And you may not even realize that this part of you exists until the markets start to fall. And when they do, you'll start to get these thoughts. Maybe I'm doing this wrong. Have I picked the wrong fund? Maybe now's the time to go to cash or buy European stocks or gold. And not only will these thoughts consume a lot of your mental energy and create stress, but they're likely to lead to mistakes. Every year, Morningstar produces a report called Mind the Gap. And in their latest version, they found that over the last 10 years, index fund ETFs in aggregate achieved an average annual return of 8.1%. But the people who invested in these funds only realized returns of 7%. So the average index investor missed out on 1.1% of returns per year. And this is entirely due to active beliefs causing investors to try and time the markets and switch between funds at all of the wrong times. But look at this. Investors that used sector equity index funds, so these are the funds that focus on a specific sector like AI or clean energy or technology, underperform the funds that they invest in by 2.9% per year on average. But this makes sense because the people who use these funds are making bets on particular sectors and clearly have more active beliefs. It's easy to stick to the plan when the markets are going up, but when the markets start to fall, as they have been doing recently, active beliefs come to the fore, and this is when the worst mistakes are made. This is why I am being so pedantic about what it means to truly be a passive investor, because if you do truly believe in passive investing and you know that you've set things up properly in the first place, then it's so much easier to block out these thoughts because there are no distractions, there are no decisions to be made. There is only one strategy. Passive investing can simplify your life, reduce stress, and deliver returns that are better than the vast majority of other investors. But you need to do it properly. And I know that getting to the level of belief that is necessary is not easy, because passive investing is not intuitive. It's not natural to accept that less is more, to accept that we have little control over our returns and to just let the markets do their things. But I think that when you understand the theory behind why passive investing works and you actually understand what good looks like, it all starts to come together. So as a reminder, I've made a guide on what passive investing should look like down in the description. So please do take a look at it and then watch this video here, because this is the video where most people get their light bulb moment and start to believe in passive investing.